The sound was faint, fragile, and almost inaudible, but it stopped Alexei Romanov in the doorway. His coat was still slung over his shoulders. His briefcase hung in his hand. For a moment, he couldn't even breathe. His twins, children who never spoke a word, never took a step, stood facing the housekeeper. Elena knelt on the parquet floor, arms outstretched, yellow rubber gloves still on. Her voice was quiet, even, a lullaby Alexei hadn't heard since his wife died. Maxim's trembling hand reached out to her. Yasha's lips parted again, the second syllable cutting through the long silence in the house. Ma. Not a cry, not a reflex, but a word. The boys moved, took steps, stretched. Not to Alexei, not to the therapists, but to her, to the housekeeper he barely knew. Alexei's heart pounded in his chest. He had built this house like this, quiet, orderly, unbreakable, a fortress against grief. And yet here, in his own living room, the impossible was happening. Elena didn't turn to look at him. She remained motionless, whispering, coaxing, as if any sudden movement could ruin the moment. Alexei clutched his briefcase, the leather creaking beneath his fingers. Everything he thought he knew about his children, about control, about what could be healed and what couldn't, was unraveling right there on the polished floor, and he hadn't even entered the room yet. Alexei didn't say a word. He couldn't. His throat was tight. His mind was already reaching the brink of disbelief. He stood slightly to the side of the doorway, half in shadow, half in the light. The words, "Ma, Ma," still echoed in his ears, like a hallucination. Maxim slowly sank to his knees, not from pain, but from exhaustion. Yasha sat next to him, his tiny hand resting on Elena's knee, as if it always knew the way. The moment was already fading, retreating back into silence. But a crack had occurred, something had opened. And when you hear your child speak for the first time, even if it was just a barely audible sigh, you never go back to the old way. Not the same man, not the same father. Alexei retreated before anyone saw him. The door clicked quietly behind him, just as before. But now the silence was no longer comfortable. It ceased to be armor. It became alien. He walked slowly, deliberately down the corridor. The mansion surrounded him like an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, expensive, suffocating. Somewhere in the formal wing, an antique grandfather clock ticks. No laughter, no tears, only the constant clinical rhythm of order. It's been like this for 2 years, since Ksenia died. The boys were born prematurely. Complications, nerve damage, paralysis. No one ever called it vegetative directly, but the word hung in the room with every diagnosis, every late-night consultation, every shrug of a shoulder in a white coat. Alexei nodded, signed papers, paid bills with hands that never trembled. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't indifferent, but he learned to stop hoping. The routine was safer. The controls were cleaner. The boys had a schedule. Nurses, therapists, doctors, spare oxygen tanks, and floor plans with accessibility in mind. No dirt, no noise, no surprises. That was the deal. And then, 3 weeks ago, Elena Sergieva arrived, found through a recommendation. She had good credentials and a quiet demeanor. She was about 30, dark-skinned, wore her uniform respectfully, asked no questions, cleaned meticulously, and kept to herself. She wasn't meant to attract attention. She was background. But the boys began to follow her movements with their eyes, at first barely noticeably, then longer, more deliberately. Their hands twitched as she passed by. Their breathing calmed as she hummed softly, sometimes so softly that the baby monitor barely picked up the sound. The nurses said it was a coincidence, maybe a mix-up, just sensory stimulation. Alexei believed them, until today. He entered the office, closed the door behind him, and leaned his back against it. The silence inside felt different, not like before. He could still hear it. Not a song, not footsteps, but simply the sound of 2 boys. Their voices like wind through thin glass, reaching for something they had no words for before. Ma. Not a miracle, not quite yet, but enough to make a man like Alexei Romanov doubt everything he thought possible. And for the first time in many years, he didn't want to be left alone with the answers. Alexei didn't return to work that day. He didn't check his appointments, didn't call the estate manager, didn't respond to the nurse's briefing on his tablet. He sat at his desk for almost 20 minutes, motionless, staring at the stain on the glass. The syllable was thin, barely formed. But it wasn't a coincidence, an echo, or a figment of his imagination. He heard it, felt it. The weight of the words still pressed on his chest. They'd said it to her. Not to the speech therapist who paid $3,000 an hour. Not to the neurologist who gave him presentations instead of answers. Not to him. To Elena, the housekeeper. He couldn't say her name without a strange knot in his throat. Alexei stood and walked to the window. From his second-floor office, he could barely make out the edge of the eastern garden. A playground, if you could call it that. A sterile patch of grass surrounded by mats and foam pads that no one used. Most days, it looked like a forgotten exhibition space, a stage space for a family that didn't exist. But today, someone opened the windows. The curtains fluttered, the air smelled of autumn, and for the first time in a long time, Alexei felt like he didn't recognize his own home. He left the office and walked slowly through the hallways, not into the living room, but around it, through the gallery, past a portrait of Kenya with an empty basket in a field that never existed. He stopped before the portrait, staring at the painted sky. Silence remained. When he finally returned to the nursery, the twins were asleep. Elena was sitting on the floor nearby, writing something in a small cloth-bound notebook, her back straight, her knees drawn up. She didn't look up when he entered. Alexei stood in the doorway longer than necessary. Elena calmly closed her notebook, placed it next to her, and turned to him. "I was reading to them," she said. "It wasn't reading," he said. "They like rhythm." Alexei entered the room. His voice didn't rise, but there was a hint of sharpness in it. They began to talk. She nodded. She tilted her head. "I don't think they're normal." He stared at her. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She seemed present, as if this wasn't a crisis but a continuation of something she already knew was possible. "They said Mom," he muttered. "They don't understand what that word means yet," she replied softly. "Not yet." Elena's gaze didn't waver. They told him that, the one who held them, fed them, talked to them even when they couldn't respond. She wasn't bragging. Her tone wasn't defensive, but matter-of-fact. "You were hired to clean," he said. Elena nodded slightly. "It's in the contract." There was a silence, not filled with anger. "I'm not trying to replace anyone, Mr. Romanov," she said, quietly. "But they don't understand contracts or boundaries." Alexei felt his neck spark. He didn't know whether it was shame or rage or something in between. He wanted to leave, end this conversation, fire her, reassert control. Elena hesitated, choosing her words. "Little things. Maxim turns his head when he hears my voice. Yasha tries to imitate sounds with his mouth." Her eyes softened, but she didn't back down. Alexei looked at the cribs. The boys were calm, their breathing even, deeper than usual, peaceful. He looked at Elena again and for the first time didn't see her as just a housekeeper. He saw the only person in the house who spoke to the boys as if they could hear her, and perhaps that's why they did. He left without saying a word. Alexei didn't stay late at work that night. He didn't return to the office. He sat in the hallway downstairs and listened to Elena lull the boys to sleep. And somewhere between the third verse and the silence that followed, he realized he hadn't thought of Ksenia with the pain that tore at him. Not once. Just enough to make him wonder what tomorrow might sound like. Elena didn't change her rhythm. Not after the boys started talking, not after Alexei's questions, not after the silence following his quiet departure from the nursery. She continued folding the laundry into perfect rectangles, humming to herself as she did. She still wore the same simple uniform, left her shoes by the back door, and left notes for the nurse in neat, rounded handwriting. If she sensed a change in the house, and of course she did, she didn't show it.
What was changing, slowly and deliberately, was the space around her. The nursery, once sterile and painted white, began to soften. Toys were no longer arranged for aesthetics. They lay where the boys had left them. Books were left open, not shelved. The curtains gradually rose a little wider each day, and in the corner, next to a small upholstered chair that hadn't been used in years, Elena left her notebook. It contained observations. The way Yasha's fingers curled when she touched his palm. The way Maxim hummed quietly and off-key during certain songs. Strange little patterns she was still learning to name. Moments she didn't want to lose to oblivion or skepticism. She didn't try to convince anyone. Not the nurses, not Alexei, not even herself. She simply showed up every morning, every moment. She talked to the boys as if they were listening, read to them as if they could understand, sang lullabies as if the words mattered, gently massaged their hands before bed, rubbed lotion into their feet, combed their hair, and whispered stories of frogs, lions, and stars that winked back. "You can feel everything, baby," she once almost whispered to Maxim. She didn't know Alexei was standing in the hallway, frozen by what he'd just heard. He hadn't intended to go there. He'd gone up to the office to leave the signed consent form for the occupational therapist. But when he heard her voice, something stopped him. Not the words, but the way they fell. Elena wasn't putting on a show. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. She was simply there, completely, as if nothing in the world mattered more than these twins before her. Alexei stood in the shadows for a long time that day. And that night, he opened the estate's internal security logs and watched the recording from the nursery, not to intrude, but to understand. He watched Maxim follow her around the room with his eyes. Yasha open and close his hand every time she slowed near his crib. Elena carefully lift each boy, slowly, talking to them as if it were the most natural thing in the world. This wasn't therapy. This wasn't science. It was something difficult to measure. He turned off the monitor and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in 2 years, he felt out of control. And for the first time in his life, he didn't want to feel it. The specialist arrived on Monday, Dr. Kovalev, a man of Kharkiv origin, stern in appearance, one of those men who always smell faintly of dry cleaning and eucalyptus. He was recommended through a neurologist in Zurich, someone Alexei had once respected. He stayed only half an hour. Elena hadn't been invited to the meeting. Alexei sat across from the doctor in the living room, sunlight streaming across the spruce parquet floor, an untouched cup of tea between them. The doctor leafed through the twins' medical records like a disappointing briefcase. "I see the guardians have recorded recent vocalizations," Kovalev said, not looking up. Alexei kept his expression impassive. "They were reaching out to her," he said quietly. The doctor paused for a moment. Now the doctor looked up, his eyebrows raised slightly. Not mocking, not quite yet. Simply a fine-tuning of someone preparing a professional response. "Mr. Romanov," he said carefully, "I understand how such moments can seem transformative, but we must remain within the framework of neuroscience. These children have significant motor impairments. They are nonverbal and likely lack symbolic cognition. These are speech reflexes," Kovalev explained calmly. "Breathing through the vocal cords, a pattern your brain desperately tries to interpret as language." Alexei's jaw clenched. The conversation ended 5 minutes later with polite handshakes and an appointment for further tests. But that night, Alexei didn't sleep. He walked into the living room, turned on the stereo for the first time in months, and stood there, letting the speakers warm up. And then he heard it from the hallway, a melody, not a stereo, not a nurse, but Elena. She was singing. He followed the sound. The song was coming from the kitchen, the dim, quiet golden light above the sink. Elena stood barefoot, swaying slightly, holding Maxim in her arms as if she'd done it 100 times.
Yasha dozed in the carrier nearby, half covered with a star-patterned fleece blanket. She sang slowly, a lullaby that was hard to recognize at first. Then Alexei's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the melody. It was Ksenia's song. Not a popular song, not something you'd find in a children's book or a parenting blog. A melody she'd come up with while she was pregnant. Simple and strange, with 3 little meaningless words that only she used. And Elena sang it perfectly. Alexei entered the room, his voice a whisper. "Elena?" he asked. Elena turned around, not looking scared, just calm. "I found it," she replied, holding out a thin, worn notebook to the tabletop, its pages brittle at the corners. She'd pulled it out from behind the bookshelf in the nursery. It contains recipes, notes, a few poems, and a lullaby. Alexei couldn't move. His hands were shaking. He opened the notebook and instantly recognized Ksenia's handwriting, slanted, neat, always written in blue. Her lullaby was there, her words written in her own hand. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "I wasn't trying to step over," she said quietly. Alexei didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight. He looked at Maxim, sleeping on her shoulder. One of the child's hands rested on Elena's heart, as if it had found a home. Tears began to flow slowly, as if her body had forgotten how to cry. Not loudly, not brokenly, but simply sincerely. He sat on the floor next to the kitchen island. The marble was cold against his back. He was silent. Elena offered no words. She simply sang. And for the first time in years, the mansion no longer felt like a crypt. It felt like something was waking up. The grass in the gardens hadn't been trampled for months, not since the gardener had mowed it in the spring, and certainly not by tiny feet. The east lawn, originally intended as a kindergarten, had become a manicured part of the grounds, beautiful but untouched. The foam mats under the awning had long since gathered dust. The toys lay unopened in plastic boxes, and the ramp from the terrace was used only for delivering things. Until today, Elena had been asking the morning nurse to help carry the boys outside. There was no fuss, no announcements, no therapists, just a fleece blanket neatly spread on the grass, a few soft pillows, and the twins. Alexei watched from the driveway. He hadn't planned this. He was returning from a canceled appointment, the kind he'd previously rescheduled 6 times to avoid having to return home mid-morning. But today, something in him turned the car toward the eastern lot, not the garage. There they were, Maxim and Yasha, not lying in hospital beds, not surrounded by monitors. They were gently propped up with pillows, looking into the wind, blinking, as if seeing the sky for the first time. Elena knelt down beside him and ran a blade of grass over Yasha's hand. His fingers tightened. Maxim made a sound, not a word, not a cry, just a small surprise sound, like a miracle trying to breathe. Elena smiled. She wasn't forcing anything. She wasn't commenting. She simply allowed the world to be new to them. Alexei got out of the car slowly, his hand on the hood. No one saw him. He didn't come any closer. He didn't want to disturb what was happening. Yasha reached for a dandelion. His hand missed, but his eyes didn't move. They remained glued to the flower as Elena held the stem and let him try again. And then, without prompting, Maxim reached out to Elena. This time, he touched her. Not a light touch, not by accident. His fingers squeezed hers with intent. Elena didn't cry. She didn't gasp. She simply nodded once, as if she'd been expecting it, as if it were the answer to 1,000 quiet questions. Later that day, Alexei returned home normally, through the front door, in time for the usual staff update, but he was greeted by no one. No therapist reports, no summonses, just a note taped to the refrigerator. It was a drawing. 2 leaf-shaped figures with tiny faces, one smiling, the other curious. Between them was a figure in a yellow dress. The caption, in neat, curly handwriting, read, "Today they stretched." Alexei stood there for a long time, reading those 3 words over and over. The drawing trembled slightly in the breeze from the ceiling fan, as if the entire house had exhaled. Later that night, he placed the drawing in a desk drawer and closed the laptop. He didn't open it again. Instead, he went upstairs, not to his office, but to the nursery. The lights were dim. Elena had already left. The nurse sat in the corner, reading. Maxim and Yasha were asleep, their arms relaxed, their cheeks rosy from the air and the sun's rays. Alexei sat on the floor next to them, his back to the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't speak, didn't try to touch them. He simply breathed, listened, and waited. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like an absence. She was a presence. It all started with a voice memo. Alexei hadn't intended to listen to it. He was reviewing the estate's expenses and accidentally opened the wrong file in Elena's shared employee folder, the one where she posted cleaning lists and supply requests. Nothing special. But it wasn't a list. It was an audio file. He recognized the rustle of a soft bed, Maxim's quiet murmur, the creak of the nursery floor. And then, Elena's close, gentle voice into the microphone. "That's right, darling. You can tell me, even if it's just sounds." A pause. Another pause. Then laughter, not hers, but Yasha's thin, dreamy voice, like the wind brushing against a bell. Alexei froze. He listened to the recording twice. Then he closed his laptop and went to look for her. He didn't knock. He simply opened the kitchen door, where she was washing something under the tap, her sleeves rolled up, her hair tucked into a headscarf. She turned calmly. "Is something wrong, Mr. Romanov?" Her hand stopped. "For the nurse." Elena nodded. Alexei entered the room. The tiles were cold under his feet. "They call you Mom," he said, the word lingering in his mouth, as if betraying something sacred. Elena dried her hands on a towel and leaned against the counter. "They don't know what a mother is, but they say it." She met his gaze calmly, without apology. The silence between them was shattered not by a scream, but by the stillness that follows something enormous shifting beneath the floor. Alexei's jaw clenched. "They have a mother," he said. Elena didn't flinch. "They did, and she loved them. I didn't come to replace her." Elena carefully folded the towel and placed it next to the sink. "I wasn't the one who built that Rhine," she said. Her voice didn't rise. He didn't need it. "Impossible?" he asked, sharply, desperately. It was the first real crack in this tone. "Let them cling to you like this? Let them think?" "I didn't make them think," she replied softly but firmly. It sounded harsher than she intended, and she felt it, but she didn't take the words back. Alexei's hands clenched at his sides, not from rage, but from grief and panic. "You?" he asked, more quietly. "I don't think anything," Elena said. Another silence followed, more intense this time, not angry, just heavy. "Will?" she asked finally. He remained silent. Alexei took a step forward, not too close, not crowding in, just enough for him to look at her directly. "Then make the first move," she said. "Be who you want someone to be." Alexei's throat tightened. She walked past him slowly, heading for the hallway. Before leaving, she said only, "You can get that back." She didn't slam the door. She didn't wait for an answer. And the next morning, for the first time since the twins' birth, Alexei Romanov didn't go to work. He sat on the floor of the nursery, awkwardly in his expensive shirt, and watched his son sleep. When they woke up, he didn't call the nurse. He extended his hand and waited to see if their hands would touch in return. The storm was approaching quietly, not with thunder, but with a dense pressure in the air, heavy clouds descending over the estate like a second ceiling. Rain pounded the nursery windows, a rhythmic whisper filling the silence without breaking it. Alexei had been sitting on the floor for the 3rd day in a row. He didn't know how to be like this, to sit still, to be present. His joints were stiff, his movements awkward. He didn't know where to look. But the boys didn't seem to mind. They didn't need words or introductions. They didn't need him to know what to do. They simply needed him to be there. Elena had said it once, presence isn't a skill, it's a choice. And so he continued to choose. He began reading to them, one page at a time, his voice lower than when he spoke at conferences or gave interviews. He wasn't sure they understood the stories, but it didn't matter. Their eyes followed the movements. Sometimes their lips echoed. Elena still kept her diary, but now it lay open on the windowsill, unhidden. Alexei had even added a few notes of his own, timid observations, no drama. Maxim turned at the sound of the bell. Yasha blinked in rhythm with the mobile phone hanging on the wall. Small things, but real. That evening, the storm intensified. The wind howled in the chimney. The power flickered once and held. The house felt cozier, as if wrapped in the weather. Elena brought extra blankets, one for each crib and one for the rocking chair. Alexei didn't leave. Around midnight, thunder suddenly rumbled. Maxim flinched, his hands twitched, his eyes widened. A soft groan crept in, barely audible. Then another sound emerged, a syllable. Zzz. Elena froze. Alexei sat up straighter, his heart sinking. Zzz, he asked. Elena nodded slowly. Maxim blinked. His lips moved again, trying to form air. It wasn't accidental, not crying or imitation. Elena leaned closer, her voice soft. Alexei's throat was dry. The child was trying to utter the only name he associated with safety, with comfort, with presence. And then, like a harmony discovered by chance, Yasha woke in his crib and echoed the same sound, broken, breathy, but undeniable. Alexei looked at Elena. She wasn't crying, but her face seemed open. "Not a language yet," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But this is trust." Alexei swallowed. He crossed the room and carefully placed his hand on Maxim's back, unsure if it was okay, but the child didn't flinch. Elena closed her eyes and Alexei did the same. He'd waited 2 years for a miracle, and it didn't come through surgery or science or anything grand. It came amidst the storm, in the quietest sound a child can make, and with the unbearable weight of understanding. I'm here. I see you. Then a job offer arrived, neatly tucked into an envelope, a cream-colored card with a gold border. A private, upscale therapy center on the other side of the state. Triple salary, housing included, flexible schedule. They heard about it through one of the nurses on duty. They looked at the records, they read the notes. Elena folded the letter and placed it at the end of her notebook. Then she returned to folding the children's clothes. She didn't tell Alexei. She didn't want to confuse clarity with pressure. She herself wasn't sure what decision she'd make. But the twins noticed. Not with words, not with hysterics, but with something subtle. Maxim became cranky in the evenings, restless even in her arms. Yasha stopped humming, watching Elena's face as if listening to something he didn't understand. It was as if they had regressed, not physically, but emotionally. The house, too, felt like some unspoken thread had been lost in the air. Alexei noticed it. He hadn't said anything for days. He simply watched and listened. One morning, he stood in the hallway and saw Elena sit down next to Maxim's crib. Her hand slowly smoothed the blanket, straightening the corners that didn't need it. Elena didn't look up. He stepped into the room and crossed his arms. Elena smiled, but sadly. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed the folder on the changing table next to her. "I prepared this yesterday," he said. She looked up the folder. Again, heavy cream cardboard, but this time with her name on the cover. Inside, a guardianship plan, partial, shared, without obligations or legal traps, just a space carved out in writing for what had already been true for months. Elena flipped through the pages, her face impassive. Elena closed the folder. "I need to think," she said quietly. Alexei nodded. Of course. She stayed in the nursery that night, not out of obligation, but simply because the rain had started again, and the twins were restless. She gently rocked Yasha until he fell asleep. Maxim snuggled into her chest. The storm outside was louder, but neither boy cried.
And then it happened. Both boys shuddered, rose on shaky elbows, and reached for her again. This time, not with open hands, but with sounds. Elena froze. They chose, not out of habit, not reflex, not dependence, but recognition. They recognized her and asked her to stay. The next morning, she returned the folder with the guardianship proposal, already signed. She didn't say much, simply slid it across the kitchen island, her fingers brushing the edge. Alexei looked down, then up at her. "Thank you," he said. Elena nodded. They'd asked, and that was enough. Not a promise. Not forever. The house simply wasn't quiet anymore. And it wasn't noisy. It wasn't filled with the dramatic chaos of laughter. But something fundamental had shifted. Now music echoed through the hallways, not from speakers, but a quiet hum, breathing and humming. Toys were left where the boys had left them. Crayons appeared in the kitchen drawer. The paper crown sat on the windowsill for weeks before anyone thought to throw it away. The mansion found its pulse again, and so did Alexei. He didn't talk about it, about the shift, about the fear, about how guilt still clawed at him in quiet moments. But he began to move differently, more slowly, more present. He canceled a trip to Geneva, postponed 2 major meetings, hired someone else to temporarily handle the estate's investments.
He began therapy, not because someone told him to, but because he could no longer live with a version of himself that didn't fit with his children. He wasn't perfect. He didn't learn to braid hair, play sensory games, or tell stories without stumbling. But he showed up. Every morning, he'd sit cross-legged on the nursery floor, letting the twins climb all over him like a playground. He'd change diapers awkwardly with extra wipes. He'd read aloud from an old children's book that Ksenia had annotated, occasionally pausing for a sore throat. Elena never corrected him. She simply handed him the next book when he was ready. And the boys, Maxim and Yasha, were changing too. They weren't speaking fluently, but they were reaching faster, looking longer, pronouncing syllables with more purpose. They began pointing, not casually, but with determination. They grabbed spoons, maintained eye contact, followed the light. For their 3rd birthday, Alexei didn't throw a gala. There were no photographers or press, just a quiet gathering in the courtyard. Elena baked the cake herself. 1 layer, white frosting, no writing. The boys wore identical soft blue shirts, their hands sticky with frosting, their cheeks flushed from the sun. A few family friends and the night nurse came. Ksenia's sister, Olga, who hadn't visited since the funeral, lingered longer than expected. It wasn't a celebration in the true sense, but rather a confirmation that this family, this fragile configuration of people, had become something real. Elena didn't answer. The sound was quiet, but it echoed through the group like thunder under velvet. No one spoke, and no one needed to. Alexei raised his head from where he was cutting fruit. His eyes met Elena's. He didn't nod, he didn't smile, but everything in him said, "Yes, yes, they see you." That night, after the guests had left and the cake had been cleared away, Alexei read the twins' stories until bedtime from the notebook Ksenia had left behind. Elena sat next to him, 1 boy on each shoulder. And for the first time since the night he'd lost everything, he didn't feel haunted. The mansion still held echoes, but these weren't echoes of loss anymore. These were echoes of life, the life that had found its way back. Not perfect, but real. 6 months later, the swing was finally installed. It stood at the far edge of the garden, just beyond the hydrangeas Ksenia had planted during her first spring season on the estate. It had 2 wide, low-slung seats with adaptive straps and soft rubber handles. The boys didn't rush to them, didn't jump or squeal. But with Elena's help and Alexei's steady hand behind them, they sat down. One after the other, first Yasha, then Maxim. Alexei pushed quietly. Slow arcs, a creak with each rise and fall. The air was warm, smelling of earth and sun. The leaves rustled softly over the terrace, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower roared. Nothing loud, nothing disturbing.
just life.
Elena sat on a low stone bench nearby, her ankles folded, watching them. The boys laughed. It wasn't a theatrical laugh, just small bursts, quiet, intermittent, genuine. Alexei had never heard anything more sacred. After a while, he slowed the swing and squatted between it. "Should?" he asked. The boys didn't respond verbally, but reached out to each other. Alexei carefully placed them on the same swing and hugged them both. They pressed close together, their legs dangling, their heads tilted in opposite directions, like mirror images. The swing rocked under their weight, then settled. Elena joined in, carefully wrapping her arms around them from behind, gently but fully. No cameras, no therapists, no speeches. Just the sound of the wind, the creaking of the swings, and the multi-layered heartbeat of a family that was broken and decided to start over, not with the promise of greatness, but simply by being there.